1 year ago tonight, I sat where you all are sitting and had the immense privilege of seeing master storyteller Sid Lieberman share his Abraham and Isaac sacrifice at Gettysburg. And then I was able to spend the next 2 days learning from him and eventually to share and to work on and to receive feedback on this story that I'm about to tell you. A few months later, he passed away. And so I thought it only fitting on this place, on this night, that I tell this story in honor of Sid Lieberman. It was a hot and humid day, a day that might have been called sultry, had the heat not crossed the line to oppressive, and had not the circumstances been so dire. The sun beat down on row upon row upon row of men dressed in varying shades of blue, gray, and butternut. Many of the men were already battle-weary and wary of the fighting to come. They'd fought the day before, fought for the good ground, for the high ground, for the ground that could easily be defended, the ground that would make it more likely that the men on their side would live. The Confederates had pushed the Union Army out of the little town of Gettysburg, but the Union had managed to hold on to heights around the town. But there were still pieces of good ground that had not yet seen battle. And it was there that much of the fighting would take place on this day. It was into this situation that the 20th Maine Volunteer Infantry Regiment marched. They were a young regiment, having been formed less than a year before, and they'd seen comparatively little battle. They were present at Antietam, but had been held in reserve, and so had experienced their first major conflict at Fredericksburg, when they were part of one of the many waves of Union soldiers that broke on the unbreakable Confederate line at Marye's Heights. After that, they missed conflict after conflict, even not taking part in the Battle of Chancellorsville only 2 months before, because they were quarantined for smallpox. And now, though they had marched more than 20 miles to reach this place on this day, they were anxious to be part of the fight. They were led by a tall, blonde man with a handlebar mustache. He had a scholarly air about him, and if you had guessed that he would have been more comfortable in front of a classroom than on a battlefield, you would have very nearly been right. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain hadn't attended West Point, nor had he been part of the proving grounds of the Mexican-American War, as many of his fellow soldiers and officers on both the Union and Confederate sides had been. Instead, he'd attended Bowdoin College, where he'd received 2 degrees before becoming a member of faculty in the fields of rhetoric and languages. When the Civil War broke out, he requested a leave of absence to go and join the Union Army. The college administration considered his request and said no. They would not allow him a leave of absence to join the Army, but they would offer him a year-long sabbatical to go and learn in Europe. Chamberlain considered their offer, accepted, and went and joined the Union Army anyway. He was made a lieutenant colonel in the newly formed 20th Maine Volunteer Infantry Regiment, and as soon as he reported for duty at the training camp there in Maine, he began applying himself to learn all of the things he had not learned in college, tactics and strategies, and spending hours and hours and hours drilling and marching and practicing shooting with his men. His superior officers quickly realized his dedication, as did the men under his command, who learned to trust this man who obviously cared for their welfare just as he cared for his own. But this determination wasn't new once Chamberlain came to join the Army. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain had grown up in Maine on a farm, and as many young men who grow up on farms, he was expected to do the daily work of the farm. But Chamberlain had a hope, a desire, a dream that he wanted to go and study at Bowdoin College. So he would rise early each morning, even earlier than he was required to for the work of the farm, study until it was time to do the farm work, and then come back and study until late at night, and do the same thing the next day, and the next day, and the next. Eventually, it was time for him to take his entrance exam, and he passed. He passed so well that he was certain that he would excel at Bowdoin. But his difficulties weren't over. Chamberlain had what was known during his time as a stammer. It would later be called a stutter, and today we would call it a disfluency. He didn't have the benefit of having a speech-language pathologist down the road who could help him, but he was determined not to let this difficulty define him. And so he developed a method of almost singing out his words in a rhythmic fashion, and then practicing that over and over again until it was not noticeable anymore. And he actually became known as an excellent speaker, so excellent that he was selected to be the speaker for his class upon his first graduation from Bowdoin. He prepared and got up on the stage and failed miserably. Within 4 minutes, he returned to his seat, red-faced and embarrassed because his stammer had returned. But he wasn't defeated, as was evidenced by the fact that 3 years later, when he again received a degree from Bowdoin College, he was again selected to be the speaker for his class. And this time gave such an excellent speech that he was cemented in history as an excellent public speaker. It was this determination that Chamberlain brought with him to the Union Army and to the field of battle that day at Gettysburg. On the second day of battle at Gettysburg, the Union line was drawn like a fishhook with a curved, pointed end to the south between two pieces of land. These pieces of land that would someday be called Little Round Top and Big Round Top. Big Round Top had a higher elevation, but Little Round Top was more important from a military perspective, and it was there that Chamberlain and his 20th Maine were sent. When he came to the top of the hill, his commanding officer, Colonel Strong Vincent, called him to the side as he sent the men to the left of the army. And he told Chamberlain, "I want you to look to the left." And Chamberlain looked, and he saw nothing, and he saw no one. "You are the extreme left of the Union Army. You must hold that ground at all hazards." And with that, he was gone, leaving Chamberlain to prepare his men for the impending battle. The professor of rhetoric and languages began to mull over those words in his head. Hold that ground at all hazards. He knew that they meant that no matter what happened, no matter who lived or who died, he could not fall back. He could not retreat. The ground they defended must be held. He looked to his right and saw men from New York and Pennsylvania and Michigan also preparing for the impending battle. And then he looked down the hill. The shrubbery and the brush and the trees were so thick that he could not see the Confederates he knew that waited at the bottom. What he did not know that the men in front of him and around the hill were from Alabama and Texas, and that the men directly in front of him were the 15th Alabama Regiment, led by Colonel William C. Oates. They were a seasoned regiment, having been formed over a year before the 20th Maine. And though they had marched 30 miles to reach this place, they too were anxious to be ready for this fight. Chamberlain began to deploy his men, still thinking of those words. But he didn't have much more time to think about it because the Confederates began coming up that hill, surging forward, and the men from Maine began to push them back. For the next hour and a half, over and over and over again, the battle came, pushing up the hill and being pushed back. At one point, Chamberlain looked and saw that the Confederates were about to sweep behind the rear, and so he commanded his men to thin out their line, even more thin than it already was, and form a right angle so the men from the south could not sweep behind. When they refused the line in this way, they pushed the Confederates back down the hill. But Chamberlain realized that his men were nearly out of ammunition, and so he sent a soldier down the line to try to get some more things with which to fight. And then the Confederates came back up the hill, and again they pushed them back, and the man came back. The soldier came back and said he had no ammunition. The fighting down the line was too hot, and none one had any to spare. Chamberlain knew as though on instinct that the Confederates would come up that hill one more time. And it was then that this professor of rhetoric and languages, this determined man from Maine, knew that the command he'd received must be kept. He called together his officers with them and then commanded his men to fix bayonets and told them that they would swing like a door on his command, surging down the hill toward the oncoming Confederates. And then waited, breathless, and the noises of battle began to come up the hill, the clinking and clanging, and the Confederates' rebel yells, and the men on the left began to move forward as though on instinct. The noise was so great they couldn't even hear his chamberlain shout at the command, "Bayonet! Forward!" The men ran down the hill, and in the next few minutes, less than 200 men from Maine captured nearly 400 men from Alabama and a few from Texas, using only their bayonets, courage, and a fierce determination that the ground they defended must be held. Many people will tell you that the turning point of the Battle of Gettysburg came on the third day, July 3rd, 1863, when over 12,000 of Lee's men marched across nearly a mile of wide open field toward a little grove of trees in the center of the Union line, and had their numbers more than decimated in what would come to be known as Pickett's Charge. But others would say that the true turning point of the battle came a day earlier, on July 2nd, at a place we call Little Round Top, when Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and his brave men from Maine determined that they would indeed hold that ground at all hazards, and in so doing, help to change their future and our past.